My name is Christy Klaus, and I'm the Family Support Coordinator for the Down Syndrome Association here in St. Louis. And I want to welcome you to our parent workshop tonight. The title of our workshop is Would Your Loved One with Down Syndrome Benefit from Counseling? So we are so excited tonight to have Leanna Sanders here from St. Louis ARC. She works with adults and with disabilities as a counselor.
Thank you so much. I am Leanna. I work at the St. Louis ARC. I've been in the field for about 10 years now. I started off at Giant Steps, School for Children with Autism, and then started working at the ARC, and I've been here for about 7 years now. Throughout that time doing therapy part-time, and we've had our therapy program full-time now for about 2 years. So really exciting, and excited to be here to talk about accessibility in counseling and accessibility for Down syndrome in counseling. Talking about making therapy accessible, especially when thinking about working with people who have Down syndrome. So what are some reasons counseling is requested? So I get a lot of requests for depression, anxiety, new life transition, jobs, grief support, and relationships. Recently, especially with COVID, we started noticing something called Down syndrome regression syndrome, which is something that I've gotten referrals for. So with that does have a lot to do with depression. That was very high throughout the pandemic. So we saw a lot more rising for Down syndrome regression syndrome, which is something that I work with. Then how do you know if your child would benefit from counseling? So I really want to talk through certain situations that can be really beneficial for really anybody, if they have a disability or not, if they have Down syndrome or not. That's always going to be really important. I really think about people who come to see me for counseling having that autonomy and talking through a situation that maybe their family isn't comfortable talking about. And just having that safe spot for them to vent, cry, anything that they feel like might be helpful for them emotionally and mental health wise. And then having time that is allocated specifically for them can be helpful for processing. Whenever we have our specific spot, an hour once a week, it can be really important for us to vent. That also helps us with our relationships outside of counseling. If somebody's struggling with work or big life transitions, they're able to talk about it in counseling. Even if people don't have a way to communicate using words, coping strategies are practiced. I see a couple of people who have Down syndrome who don't use words to communicate. So typically, like the first part of our session, we're going to do a lot of coping strategies, and that might involve calming our nervous system, which looks a lot like deep squeezes. So I might have somebody mimic me doing really big, deep hugs or deep hand squeezes, touching shoulders to ears. So we do a lot of that, and then a lot of deep breathing so that people can learn those coping strategies when they are really anxious. So even if we don't have words to communicate, learning ways to help calm our body is going to be really important. I think weighted blankets can be really helpful for that too. So even if we're going into a doctor's appointment, we can have a little weighted blanket on our lap. So sometimes I'll start a session off with somebody who might need a weighted blanket in the beginning. So I really try to focus on those calming strategies, even if we're not able to talk through them using words. Does the level of communication of the person with Down syndrome have an impact? So nonverbal communication device. So we really want to think about using an AAC device. Even if somebody doesn't use one, I usually try to use pictures or videos and assistance with learning strategies through calming and modeling, which we just talked a little bit about. I've worked with someone who has Down syndrome who does not use words to communicate, and they don't use an AAC device. So typically the beginning of our sessions would look a lot like modeling and coping strategies. So we've already gone through that a little bit. And then I might show a video. This person in particular is going through a grief process. So I usually try to show a video of like an educational video based on their interests or their or kind of what they're able to understand with grief. So I try to do that. And then I might read a little story to them about grief, or make a social story that they can relate to. So if they had a friend that passed away, I might create a social story that has to do with grief about a friend and how they can cope. So, and who's in their circle of support. So I really try to cater it to that person. Just because somebody might not be able to use words to communicate doesn't mean counseling can't be useful. So a lot of times my counseling for people who don't use words to communicate might be a lot of videos, might be a lot of me reading books and reading social stories. And then also I try to bring family members in to help out with that and kind of have them do the same strategies at home, because repetition can be really important. And then accessibility in sessions. I really try to focus on the accessibility and autonomy of a person. So this right here is an emotions wheel that we have on the bottom left corner. This can be really good pictures wise. So if we have somebody coming into their session, the first thing before we even go over our calming strategies, I might show somebody the feelings wheel. And we might use that 3 times throughout our session or even more. Like, how are you feeling today? And we're able to use pictures to identify it. That way somebody, if they're feeling really sad, they would be able to point to that. And that day we might focus a little bit more on coping strategies versus the videos, because the videos could make someone a little more upset if they're fully aware of what kind of grief they're having. Or I'll use the emotions wheel after I might show them a video or read the social story. So that way we can have little check-ins throughout the session. And that's good practice to use the emotions wheel and identify emotions so that they can utilize that at home, and explain kind of how they might be feeling before we get really upset. So that's been helpful for families to use as communication as well. These are something that I like to use to help people who might have a tough time verbalizing their emotions or who don't use words to speak. And then I think I had mentioned also that I like to match it with the AAC device. So dependent on what somebody has what emotions somebody has listed on their AAC device, I try to match those with the feelings wheel. And sometimes the feelings wheel might be the first time it's getting introduced. Sometimes speech therapists use those as well. But those have been pretty beneficial. I also practice calming strategies again. I think those can be really useful, especially outside of therapy. Typically, if somebody's working on those in sessions, I recommend that they do work on those calming strategies outside of it. So the deep breathing, it might be, I have one person that I work with who, when they start feeling flustered, we created a little stop sign that's laminated and they just hold it in their pocket. And when they feel like they need a break, they can just hold it up. So that part, we worked on regulating our emotions and knowing when we need to take a break. And then I like to use personal photos if possible. A lot of times with grief, that can be really helpful to identify who the person is who died, as well as their support system. Personal photos can really help bring back that that relativity home. So understanding like, okay, this is the person who died, this is why I'm feeling this way, and then who can I reach to for support? And that's a really good way. Repetition is a really good way to help with therapy in that and help people grieve with their families and identify their emotions to their family members. We do a lot of practice with that. Grief can be really difficult because sometimes people feel like if they're still grieving, they're not living appropriately, which isn't the case. So I really try to explain grief during our sessions, that it's not just a step-by-step thing and you're done. I usually try to explain that it's kind of like you're building your life around grief. So I usually do a journal for that. And then we talk about the people in their life that do help them.
We've noticed in individuals with Down syndrome that grief can resurface, or someone will be talking about a loss and then it happened 10 years ago, but it seems like it was last week to them. And then they can get caught up in a grief cycle again from something that has happened long ago that
Yeah.
maybe they thought was processed. I don't know if you've seen that amongst other individuals with Down syndrome.
Yes, that's actually so part of the ARC is teaching mental health first aid right now, and that's actually part of something that I mentioned in training is people who have Down syndrome typically will feel those emotions like it just happened. So kind of what Christy was saying, their grief the first day that it happens, years down the road, they're still going to feel it like that. So seeing somebody to talk to in the beginning stages can be really beneficial to work through those emotions and also learning how to cope well. Coping can be really hard, especially with grief. That's a really hard thing, especially if you're feeling those strong emotions over and over again. If anybody knows Barbara Stewart, she had a really good analogy that a lot of times people who have Down syndrome see it in images over and over again, like it was just happening. So I really, really appreciate that perspective and really try to tell staff that we work with and parents that we work with that this is not fake. This is something that is real. This is the person feeling that emotion like it just happened. Thank you, Christy. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Happened at our house, so I'm sure it happened with someone else.
Yeah. It's very, very needed to know. And then the use of games. So I like to use Uno a lot. Talking to somebody face to face and looking them in the eye is very awkward. So I try to make it less awkward and less like somebody's in trouble, like they have to talk. I really try to focus on that rapport building. So I'll bring out Uno the first few sessions if somebody is pretty uncomfortable or might not know what to talk about. So I'll bring Uno out, and maybe the second or third session we'll start talking about what's been going on. So that kind of makes it a little less anxiety provoking. A lot of times, like people with Down syndrome might have anxiety going to something new. It's out of their routine. The sensory overload might be really hard. It's a new building, it's a new space. So I really try to emphasize that this is not you getting in trouble. This is for you to feel safe and comfortable. And Uno or Go Fish can make it feel more comfortable. So this is a really great website. I use this a lot for whenever we're talking about grief, especially that repetitiveness that you can utilize for somebody who has Down syndrome when they are feeling those grieving emotions like they had happened the day before, even if it's a couple years later. So these are free social stories. And Christy, I can send you the link to these if this would be helpful.
Yes, and I can send it out to everybody. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So what is a social story? Social stories are great because sometimes words can be really hard to listen to while you're overwhelmed. I really like to use social stories when somebody's really anxious or really heightened in their emotions. Looking at pictures and not listening to somebody talk can be a lot easier. So how do you use a social story? So it's really nice for somebody to get a social story if they might not necessarily understand what grief is like and what grief means. These are social stories that are about death. I'm trying to figure out how to download these while I'm on here. But it typically goes over like what does it mean when somebody dies? So when somebody dies, they're no longer in pain. We cannot see them anymore. What can we do if we're feeling sad, and talks about all our support systems. So this has been a really, really great use. I'm very thankful I found this website. I think if you look up brief social stories, you should be able to find these, but I'm definitely going to send it to Christy so we can access that. I'm thinking I might not be able to download them right now because I'm on the screen. So you'll get the link and you can download these. I typically in my sessions will send them home as well to families to use. And then I'll keep one for myself in sessions, and we typically read over that while we're in session. grief sentence completion. So typically if I've done a couple sessions in this, if somebody doesn't like writing, we usually talk through it, or I'll prompt them to draw. So I might do right now I feel, and that person can draw how they're feeling, or we can utilize the feelings wheel for this. And then the I feel saddest when. Typically, I'll to make it accessible, I usually try to do some drawing stuff. This might not work all the time. But this has been really nice because it kind of simplifies how somebody might be feeling if they feel very overwhelmed. And like the thing I miss most about the person, sometimes it's hard to, when you're feeling these big grieving emotions, it's hard to narrow that down. So it's nice to think about specific memories. And typically after we finish this, I always ask if they want to talk to their loved ones about this or do this activity with their loved ones. It's a really great way to connect with people after somebody has passed. Grief can be a really, really big change in somebody who has Down syndrome. Before I was talking a little bit about COVID and depression and that causing a lot of the Down syndrome regression syndrome. So grief and depression can kind of go hand in hand. So I typically try to help somebody out with this right away. That way we can try to avoid any symptoms. So typically these are the things that I utilize for grief. If somebody does not use words to communicate and this may not work for them, I will try to do the feelings wheel and also the videos. I'm going over a lot of the grief piece, but I think it, kind of what Christy was saying, it's a big piece of it and people will be affected by it like it just happened the rest of their life. Yeah, and then this link will also get. So how does confidentiality work? So it's pretty interesting. A couple of people that I do get for therapy might have been to a therapist who has not worked with somebody who has a disability before, so they let the guardian in the whole time. I typically try to give the person that I'm working with autonomy. I usually need written consent and release of information. But typically at the end of our sessions, I'll have the loved ones come in for the last 15, 20 minutes if the person consents. That way we can all work together on our goals and they can see what we're working on in therapy and make that accessible in the home. And this is typically whenever I'll go over the feelings wheel or anything that we might be going over. So along with that, I typically need written consent. The therapist is verbally directed by someone to tell someone else the information. The therapist determines you are a danger to yourself or others. The therapist has reasonable grounds to suspect abuse or neglect. And the therapist is ordered by a judge to disclose information. Typically, we don't need to worry about those because the person I'm working with is okay with the family members coming in. And that way we're able to give that piece of information. And sometimes it might be, hey, don't tell them about this, but I would like help with this when I'm at home. So we'll typically go over that and make a plan. I've worked with many families, some which are who are on here, where they've been great about communication, and I like to make it a team effort. So we're all working with this together. I might see somebody an hour a week, an hour every 2 weeks, but at home is where we can utilize those skills that are being learned. And it just makes me appreciate all the families that I work with a lot because it's, you guys are the ones helping and it helps the person that I'm working with that you love able to work past what they're going through. All right, and then kind of going back to that autonomy and confidentiality, I like to respect autonomy and decision making. A lot of times, the first time somebody comes to see me, they think they're in trouble because they weren't supposed to be feeling those emotions. And it's typically for grief, which is interesting. Just the amount of emotion somebody might be feeling can cause a lot of anxiety and stress, and that makes it really hard to handle your day. So they might feel like they're getting in trouble when they come see me. Hence, we go back to Uno and make it a little more fun. And then I like to ask clients if they're okay with others being involved in the treatment process. And then in the intake, we state caregivers or loved ones can come into the session the last 15 to 20 minutes if the person gives consent to that. A lot of times people are pretty okay with giving that consent. So that's been nice to be able to get family members to be part of the process, which I always appreciate. Therapy can be for everyone. I like to make therapy accessible, and coping strategies can be learned without talking. Images can help with learning emotion, and giving support can go a long way. So even if somebody might not utilize words to talk, might not know how to identify emotions, I really emphasize making it for everyone. And that can look very different. Even if it's like 6 sessions and we just practice going over calming strategies, drawing pictures, and going over what's been going on. And that can also look like coming as you need. So that could be one session every couple months to talk through a big thing that may have just happened, or like something that happened at your job. I truly believe that therapy can be for everyone if people make it accessible. Part of my role is helping students learn how to do therapy with people with disabilities. Mental health and disability have often been thought of as very separate. So I've been really trying to bridge that gap through our mental health first aid, and then also having practicum students learn that you can make it accessible and it's not scary. Because everyone can benefit from therapy. It just means that you have to figure out meeting the person where they're at. And that's typically what I really try to do. And it's been pretty helpful so far. And then referrals for adults, Provident Counseling, Scott Morrow, he actually worked at the St. Louis ARC for a little bit, the Family Resource Center, the Counseling Center, and Creve Coeur Community Counseling. And then referrals for children, Epworth, Creve Coeur Community Counseling, and Lee Bascom. Lee Bascom is wonderful. She's a play therapist and does so much. Which kind of reminds me, I also do a little bit of play therapy. So that's also really helpful when somebody might not be able to utilize words to communicate. I'll typically try to bring out dolls or something that represents a family, or maybe a pet passed away. So that can be something that can be really useful. Lee Bascom is great at making therapy accessible. I cannot say enough good things about her.
So a quick question, does she target, when you say for children, is it a specific age? Are we looking at 18 and under, or
I think it's 13 and under.
13. Okay. I was curious if she followed more of a developmental age or actual physical age. So 13 and under. Okay.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, she's more 13 and under. And then Mercy Clinic Pediatrics, they've been really great, but I could not recommend Lady Bascom more. She's great. She has a lot of experience working with people who have disabilities and really makes it accessible. And then I'm pretty sure my PowerPoint is over, but I also wanted to go over a little bit. I did not have the specifics of this in here, but I wanted to go over the specifics of narrative therapy that I utilize, especially going into Down syndrome regression syndrome. That can be something that's really hard to deal with if anybody's had that happen to their loved one. That's something where people regress, and it can be due to depression they're thinking. And typically with that, if somebody is dealing with symptoms with that, I try to do a lot of narrative therapy. And that involves, which is great when families get involved, because they'll send me the weekly schedule and talk through, like, we did this on Tuesday, this on Wednesday, we went to this music festival. So I'll usually do a narrative therapy with that. And I'll say, Bob went to this on Wednesday. What was the event? And then we'll do a narrative about it. So this helps with memory and also sentence completion. So over time, and that might take about a year of overtime of learning how to have those conversations and back and forth talking about their schedule and their day. So narrative therapy can be really great, and that's also something that you can do at home. So like if you had a big schedule on Friday, you could always say, hey, I saw you went to this event this morning. What event did you go to? And you do want to use the person's name, and that helps them identify what their schedule is. So I did want to briefly go over that. It's pretty specific, but I really wanted to talk about that.
If you could maybe touch on anxiety and OCD.
Anxiety, we definitely work on. I have something where it's called a body scan. And I typically give them the sheet of paper to bring with them. And we practice that in therapy. So it's, how does my body feel? How am I able to concentrate? How is my breathing? So it's 3 things that you can think about. So for anxiety, I typically, after we go over that in the session and we practice all of that, like, where do I feel anxiety in my body? I feel it in my chest. I feel it in my throat. So typically seeing, okay, we're going to see when this happens, we're going to do some calming strategies. And that might be deep breathing or the 5 senses technique. So for the 5 senses technique and deep breathing, I'd usually print off something with images. So like, what do you see? What do you hear, smell, touch, and taste? Yes, taste. So I'll print off something with pictures for that. That can be really helpful with anxiety. It goes hand in hand. So 3 body scans a day, and then we're going to practice the 5 senses technique. And that practicing, and I usually say practice it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just as a timing to know when to practice it. And that helps people practice those skills and then be able to utilize them whenever they are feeling that way. So we don't necessarily need to do the check-in when we're feeling anxious, but practicing in that repetition can be really, really helpful, especially for people with Down syndrome where those emotions are getting really heightened and feeling like you're in that experience again. That way it's more automatic. And then OCD. So typically with the clients who I see for OCD, if they're having symptoms while they're in session, I have a little ball that will pass back and forth so that they're not really holding on to that thought. It sounds a little silly, but it helps break up the thought process and keep things moving. OCD can be really hard. That can be a very difficult thing to do in counseling, and I highly recommend speaking to a doctor about medication as well. I'm not a doctor, so I don't want to prescribe anything or say anything, but definitely speaking with a psychiatrist can be helpful. But typically we talk about, where does that emotion start? It's a lot of, where do you feel that in your body? What is the impulse that you need to do? And then kind of learning how to regulate your body in those moments. And therapy doesn't always have to stop. I do short-term therapy, but that doesn't mean we get to 20 sessions and we're done. They can always come back. So it might be as needed. For OCD, I think trying to keep somebody's brain moving can be really helpful. I try to do that in therapy, and it kind of helps somebody not remain stuck on a thought. And that's kind of the ball tossing. It creates a less rigid environment where people can feel a little bit more at ease.
Who would be eligible and how would people access you through St. Louis ARC? Like, who can do that and how does that work?
Right now, since I'm the only person providing therapy to adults at St. Louis ARC, they have to be in a program at St. Louis ARC currently. We're hoping to hire more people and being able to see people outside of the ARC. I would love to make that a possibility. Adults, anybody who's 18 and older, and currently getting services at the ARC. And the list of therapists that I had on this page, and then I shared a larger list with Christy, they are all people who parents have said that have done really great with their loved ones.